Well, good evening, and thank you, Jonathan, for the very kind introduction. Thank you also to Professor Reichman and Professor Granor, and to all participants in the ICT conference at IDC for inviting me again to speak this year as part of this solemn memorial and this tradition to have this conference take place at the same time as we remember the terrible events of September 11th. I really deeply appreciate the time set aside at each year's World Summit on Counterterrorism to honor the memory of the victims of terrorism from 9/11 and from other attacks around the world. It's meaningful that this memorial ceremony opens several days of discussions and learning about how to fight and defeat terrorism, because that's a central goal that the United States shares with Israel and with many, many other allies who are represented here. To the ICT team and the counterterrorism professionals here today, thank you for all that you do. And let me just say that the U.S. Embassy is honored to join in supporting this important conference. Minister Gilad Erdan, Shabtai Shavit, Judge Jean-Paul Laborde, Assistant Secretary General and Executive Director of the United Nations Counterterrorism Committee Executive Directorate, Lieutenant Colonel Jeremy Bentel, U.S. Army War College Fellow at ICT. We're very proud of you, Jeremy. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for everybody for joining this summit and being part of this ceremony. As Jeremy mentioned, everyone remembers where he or she was exactly 15 years ago today when we heard the horrific news that our country had been attacked. It's a day deeply etched in my memory, which I spoke about in some detail at our memorial ceremony this morning in Emek HaArazim. But I also spoke about the fact that now we face the task of educating a new generation rising to adulthood, which was not old enough to remember the events of 9/11. A young person reaching maturity today had no memory of those events. So as 9/11 begins its slow, inexorable transition from living memory to history, we must help them understand the meaning of these events and the lessons to be drawn from them. The memory of the heroes and the victims of 9/11 is still embedded in our hearts, and that is part of what we must pass forward. For family members and those who are closest to the victims, the pain of that loss never lifts. As a nation, we're committed to remembering and commemorating their lives. The United States' newest national memorial is located in a clearing in a forest in Somerset County, Pennsylvania, the site of the crash of United Airlines Flight 93. Dedicated just a year ago by the National Park Service, the memorial recognizes the heroism of the plane's 40 passengers and crew members who, against all odds, thwarted an attack on the Capitol, an attack that would have made 9/11 even more calamitous than it was. I was at work at the Capitol that very morning, and their heroism may very well have saved my life as well. Today, we honor their memory, together with the memory of nearly 3,000 innocent civilians, among them 5 Israelis, who were killed at the World Trade Center and the Pentagon and on the 3 other planes hijacked that day. The international response to America's grief after 9/11 indeed was humbling, and it still is. In the immediate aftermath of tragedy, the American people encountered unprecedented sympathy from nations around the world. That sympathy was especially heartfelt coming from the Israeli people, a nation that has suffered the scourge of terrorism for far too long and at seemingly an unbearable price. We saw vividly in those days that resilience and an indefatigable national spirit are values that Israel and the United States share beyond our mutual commitments to democracy, freedom, and rule of law. After 9/11, America's allies shared not only our grief, but also our determination to strike at the enemy that dispatched the terrorists and the regime that sheltered them in Afghanistan. That's why NATO invoked Article 5, its collective security clause, for the first time in its history, less than 24 hours after the attack. Today, terrorists know the U.S. and its allies not only grieve together, they also fight together. The heinous terrorist attacks of the past year, from Paris to Istanbul, from Nigeria to Brussels, and so many others, are an affront to our common humanity, and they redouble our resolve to degrade and defeat our enemies. Terrorism, of course, remains a real threat here in Israel as well, and it's a threat that constantly affects Israelis' daily choices. Should I get on that bus? Should my child walk to school today? And in some parts of the countries, residents ask themselves, can I even go outside today? Israelis show the most admirable resilience in the face of these threats, but frankly, they should not have to put up with them. This past year has been especially difficult. Last October, I attended the funeral of Richard Lakin of blessed memory, a teacher and peacemaker who was brutally, viciously murdered in a terrorist attack on a Jerusalem bus. In November, Ezra Schwartz of blessed memory, a young student in the flower of his youth, was stolen from his family. In March, during Vice President Biden's visit to Israel, Taylor Force, an American graduate student from Vanderbilt University, who was in Israel on a study tour, was stabbed to death by a terrorist just down the road from our embassy. These are just three names, three American citizens among too many Americans and Israelis murdered just since we last gathered at this memorial. Today, I'd like to focus the remainder of my remarks on our bilateral cooperation on security and counterterrorism. On Tuesday night at this conference, National Counter-Terrorism Center Director Nick Rasmussen will discuss the broader U.S. strategy and draw on the perspectives he brings from Washington and the intelligence community. Our counterterrorism cooperation with Israel is close and multi-layered. We take Israel's security extremely seriously and work very closely with our Israeli counterparts to counter a range of threats to Israel's security from states and terrorist actors. Every week, it seems, I'm hosting in my office the United States general officer or admiral or undersecretary who is visiting Israel to discuss security cooperation with their Israeli opposite number. When the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Marine Corps General Joe Dunford, made his first trip abroad as chairman, he came to Israel before visiting any other country. He was back again in the spring, and he met again at the Pentagon just last month with IDF Chief of Staff Gadi Eisenkot to discuss our robust military-to-military relationship. The close coordination and interoperability between our militaries is made possible in part through bilateral training. Exercises like Noble Shirley 16, which took place this past July in Israel, with about 350 Marines and sailors from the 22nd Marine Expeditionary Unit and about 150 soldiers from the IDF. And our special forces also train together, and one of these exercises has been running for 30 years. This past summer, a delegation of 15 senior American local law enforcement officials, including Orlando Police Chief John Mina and the Sheriff of San Bernardino County, John McMahon, was also in Israel for a counterterrorism seminar after those two communities had suffered such terrible attacks. The Institute for Counterterrorism at IDC routinely consults with American professionals, and we're very glad that those exchanges of knowledge continue day by day. The United States has invested significantly in many of Israel's most effective defenses against terrorist threats. Over the past several years, we've invested in Iron Dome, David Sling, and Arrow 3, and have devoted extensive capabilities to shielding Israel from the threat of ballistic missiles and rockets. All of these efforts, with a multi-billion-dollar price tag, help protect Israel from the threat of rockets. The success of Iron Dome, in particular, demonstrates how well spent that money is. Iron Dome's incredible success rate during Operation Protective Edge, successfully shooting down over 700 rockets headed for populated areas, saved countless lives on both sides of the conflict. The fight against terrorists must always adapt to changing threats, which is why the IDF and our Department of Defense are now focused on the newest threat, the threat of tunnels, and developing the most sophisticated anti-tunneling technology in the world, for which the U.S. is providing more than $40 million to Israel. In keeping with America's commitment to preserve Israel's qualitative military advantage, by the end of this year, the Israeli Air Force will take delivery of the first F-35 Joint Strike Fighter in its inventory. This is the latest manifestation in a long history of Americans helping Israel defend itself with cutting-edge airborne platforms. The Israeli Air Force has an illustrious record with American planes, from A-4 Skyhawks and F-4 Phantoms to C-130 Hercules aircrafts to F-15s and F-16s. Now, the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, the Adir, will form the backbone of the Israel Air Force for the next generation and will enable Israel to reinforce its deterrent power and maintain its legendary quick response capabilities when new threats emerge, including state sponsors who support terrorist attacks against Israel in its homeland. Israel is the first country outside of the United States to receive this revolutionary new aircraft. The next decade of American military support for Israel is to be spelled out soon in a memorandum of understanding our countries have been discussing in recent months. The new agreement with Israel will guide our military assistance until 2029, National Security Advisor Susan Rice told the American Jewish Committee a few months ago, and it will be the single largest assistance package with any country in American history. And I hope we'll be able to take the final steps to complete this MOU very soon. Counterterrorism is a campaign against constantly moving targets, and the campaign against ISIL illustrates this fact. These days, terrorists slip across borders and reach across borders to recruit and move money and materiel. That's why intelligence professionals, militaries, and law enforcement are refreshing their toolkits to keep pace with this changing environment. Mass attacks, we've learned, don't necessarily come out of the clear blue sky like they did on 9/11. In the past year, we've seen mass terror attacks carried out with small arms and assault rifles, and in Nice, France, with a truck. We also know ISIL can inspire attacks through the internet, which is why cyber measures and counter-messaging have become important parts of our counterterrorism arsenal as well. The global struggle against terrorism requires intricate planning and coordination among countries at the military and diplomatic levels. Besides modern means of financial intelligence, cybersecurity, financial intelligence, cybersecurity, and other intelligence sharing, it also demands the force of warplanes and drones and at times boots on the ground. Today, more than 60 partners contribute to Operation Inherent Resolve, our campaign to defeat and destroy ISIL in Iraq and Syria. Our coalition has carried out more than 13,000 airstrikes in addition to what we're doing quietly on the ground. We're working with our partners to improve border security, reduce the flow of foreign fighters into Iraq and Syria, and to cut off ISIL's financing. As a result, ISIL is losing. It has lost approximately 50% of its populated territory that it once held in Iraq and more than 20% in Syria. The group has lost a quarter of its overall manpower, and its oil revenues are plummeting, along with much of its morale. None of ISIL's leaders are safe, President Obama said last month, and we are going to keep going after them. Indeed, we have taken out and are continuing to eliminate senior ISIL leaders and commanders. Are we satisfied? No, because as the President said, if you're satisfied, that means the problem is solved, and it's not. With Israel, we are in close contact and constant contact about our parallel and complementary efforts, our broader campaign, as well as Israel's actions to safeguard its frontier with Syria. The United States has been at war with terrorists incessantly since 9/11. We've had many successes. Our intelligence and law enforcement agencies have thwarted dozens of plots. Our military and counterterrorism professionals have disrupted terrorist networks and their safe havens overseas. We tracked down and killed Osama bin Laden, and ISIL is in retreat. But as the President said, the problem is not solved. We continue to take seriously the threats posed by ISIL, by Hezbollah, by Hamas, by other jihadist organizations, and we have no illusions about Iran's dangerous and destabilizing influence in the region, from its nuclear ambitions to its support for terrorist proxies. Though we face significant challenges, there is reason for optimism. We adhere to a set of values that is more persuasive than the ideology of hate and destruction that terrorists wish to sow. We're pursuing terrorists in close cooperation with capable allies, and our efforts are supported by the most advanced military and cyber technologies that our enemies cannot match. America is an indispensable force for good around the world, President Obama said at a 9/11 memorial at Fort Meade last year. Our military is a linchpin in our ability to project our values alongside our diplomatic efforts, our economy, and our people-to-people relations. Because of the actions we've taken and the boundless energy and resilience of the American people, Vice President Biden wrote recently in Foreign Affairs, we can be optimistic about our capacity to guide the international community to a more peaceful and prosperous future. Thank you again for the honor of joining you at the conference.
Please remain here. Okay.